I got the bulk of this story from an online journal. I should clarify that it isn't mine, so there may be elements that could benefit from some sober and rational explanation, and I won't always be able to offer that. My name is Jason, but my friends call me Jace. The journal in question belonged to a friend of mine, or rather, someone that used to be a friend of mine. It was on a public journalism website, which many of you will know of. Perhaps you're even a member yourself. I'd forgotten all about it, to tell you the truth. I'd long grown out of blogging my every thought, feeling minor achievement and perceived injustice in the world, with the faint hope that the throngs of the internet would find me fascinating. I'd never deleted my account forever, and with a little thought I was able to recall my password and log in. After a quick browse through my old entries, rolling my eyes, chuckling and thanking Christ, I wasn't that ranting teenager anymore. I decided to check on the journals of a few of my old friends. Most were inactive accounts, or had simply not been updated in years. But then as my gaze skimmed along the list of abstract, comical, and melodramatic blogger names, my eye fixed on one which caused my blood to chill in my veins, and a tumult of painful memories to flood my mind, shattering the pleasant nostalgia. Patrickster87. Oh my god, Patrick. Pat, who I'd attended college with, gone on lads' holidays with, and years before, been tight teenage friends. Pat had grown up in the same smallish town as me. Our parents knew each other, we'd shared a lot over the years. He'd been like a brother to me, and I to him. We'd have always promised to be there for each other, if saying something like that hadn't been suicide for the masculinity. But I'd always felt there was an unspoken understanding. Thinking back to our time at college, we worked well together. I was what you might call sensible, a little reserved, but also more level-headed than Pat. I tended to be the one with a job and a handle on our plans for the weekend. He was just all about living life, really outgoing but not obnoxious with it. The kind of guy always at the center of the fun, but still pretty intelligent. He joked that he was studying history of literature and weed. He was usually in a group of people he was making laugh by acting the clown. You know the kind of guy. He had a lot of friends. Guy friends and girlfriends, oh yeah. And the girlfriends. He was in and out of relationships more times than I could remember. There was generally a minimal drama, but some of the relationships barely reaching a full week. He insisted to me that he always ended things with a genuine, "Let's still be friends, yeah?" But the girls rarely took him up on his offer. One night when we were just chilling in his dorm room, doing a little smoking and perhaps more than a little drinking, he confided to me his sincere desire to find the right girl and settle down. I snorted my disbelief and said, yeah, I'm sure," glancing over at his door where a petite brunette in a very short denim skirt and almost see-through t-shirt had exited a few hours ago when I arrived. But he sat up and continued. "No, seriously, man. I know there's been a lot of girls." He grinned at this point and glanced at his phone out of the corner of his eye, clearly expecting a text from another girl at some point that night. "But it's just because I'm a passionate person, you know? If I meet a girl I like, I want her to be my girlfriend right there, right now. If it doesn't work out, I'll worry about that later. Cross that bridge when we come to it, you know?" He took another drink. "Seriously though, if I met the right kind of girl, all bets would be off. That would be me sorting it all out. No more messing around, no more cheating. Gotta make a real go of it, you know? Treat her like a princess, with respect. That's what love is, man." "Yeah, I know," I said, considering his words. "I just want to ask you one thing." "Sure, shoot." "When the fuck did you start reading Cosmo magazine?" I grinned broadly, still slouching on his couch. I raised my arm a little too slowly to deflect the empty beer can thrown at my head. We both laughed. Thinking about those days gives me a strange feeling in my chest. A sort of tight numbness where my ribs feel constricted, but my heart beats stronger than ever. It's bittersweet. Remember my old friend in the time before everything just went crazy. Looking at his online journal, I see that it is set to private, viewable only by his friends. To my knowledge, that means me, and maybe only 1 or 2 or 3 people. I scroll through the entries until I see a significant date gap. One entry titled something about summer break dating from somewhere in the middle of high school. It has a gap after it of nearly 6 years, and is followed by an entry titled simply, Day 1, Sunday. I have read the story I'm about to share with you, possibly 100 times over. It doesn't get any easier, but to make the situation clearer to you, I will include my own notes between some of the entries, to provide context and later on, a connection to reality. None of the entries had any comments, seemingly never being read after publishing, as if Pat was just posting his desperate story into the void. Day 1, Sunday. Dear Diary. This feels kinda weird. I haven't been on here in so long, not since I was a teenager. Well, where to begin catching you up? I'm a 20-something, 150-pound something, good-looking college struggler. Hey, thank you. It was recommended to me by Dr. Chen that I keep a journal and update it with how I'm feeling day to day. I guess starting on a Sunday seems a bit odd, but this might be an odd journal. Anyway, I got into some trouble recently. Apparently I have issues with authority figures and anger management. Yeah, another way to say that is I don't take any bullshit from anybody. I guess I can overreact sometimes though. I'm working on it. The trouble Pat refers to in this entry is nearly being kicked out of college for smoking weed. We had a fairly sympathetic staff on our campus, but you still couldn't wander around blatantly smoking in broad daylight. Needless to say, there was a confrontation, Pat didn't react well, and there was a rumor that things got violent. It should have resulted in immediate expulsion, removal from campus, and possible jail time. But Pat managed to sweet-talk his way out of that, explaining that he was struggling with the stress of college work and some personal problems, and instead was referred to mandatory counseling. We high-fived about it back then. Day 2, Monday. Hey again. Well, this is day 2 on my path of self-discovery and whatever. I had my second session with Dr. Chen today. She's my counselor, kind of a weird Chinese hippie chick. I think she's in her 50s. She's really small. I feel so tall when I'm in a room with her. Anyway, she's really nice. Encourages me to talk about my feelings. It's still weird. I know I can be a bit impatient and sometimes I just flip out if people push me too far. But Dr. Chen doesn't seem to think that it's a problem. She says I need to let the anger out. It's strange. She talks about it like it were alive, like an animal or something, in a cage. In captivity, your anger will writhe and coil, fighting against its bonds, forever seeking release and liberty. There is no good that can come from strangulating it. It is no noble act to deny its freedom. Maybe it will start to make more sense after a few more sessions. Whatever. Don't have time to write more. I have plans tonight. It's gonna get crazy. I never met Dr. Chen, and Pat never much talked about his sessions. His appointments were off campus, and as he had his own car, there was never a need to give him a lift, and in doing so, scope out where he was going. All in all, none of his friends seemed to pay it much thought. The plans he mentioned were a party at a friend of ours' house. I don't remember much about it. We all got pretty wasted. I do know we both hooked up with some girls that night. For me, it didn't go any further than the next morning, but for Pat, it was different. Day 5, Thursday. Hey, sorry I haven't updated in a couple of days. I haven't been home. I met this girl the other night at this party. I was crazy drunk. She is awesome, though. We've just been hanging out at her apartment. She isn't at any of the local colleges. I was surprised because the party was mostly college students. It's cool though, as it means none of my friends know her, and so they can't start talking about us. I've had probably more girlfriends than is really okay. I'm not a totally asshole or anything, but I just find it hard to settle, I guess. But Nicole, that's her name, is great. Amazing, actually. She works in a coffee shop in town. She had to go in yesterday, but instead of going home, I just went in with her and watched her serve customers all day. She's tall, but not too tall. Slim and sorta tan, but not in a fake way. She has long, dark brown hair that feels like cool liquid to run your fingers through. And she has the most beautiful face with big hazel eyes. Part of me wants to take her out just to show her off to everyone. But another part of me wants to hide her away from the world so I don't have to share her. Let me just say this about that. I'd say the second part of his mind won over in the end because we, myself and the rest of Pat's friends, never got to meet Nicole more than once. From that day on, we all began seeing less and less of Pat. He was always at his new girlfriend's house or at his appointments. Dozing through class, or on the rare occasion he was in his dorm, he was unconscious, sleeping the sleep of the dead. Day 6, Friday. See? I'm doing my best to update daily like Dr. Chen said. She didn't seem pissed that I missed a few appointments. That's good because I was kind of worried I'd be in some kind of trouble. She just seemed interested to hear about Nicole. I must have talked about her for nearly the whole session. I had to stop myself a couple of times because I started talking kind of fast. I feel pumped, full of adrenaline. I told her that Nicole wears a braided bracelet around her ankle, just like the ones Dr. Chen has on her tiny wrists. She smiled and said they are good luck or something. More encouragement to update the journal. Will do. Am doing, see? Day 7, Saturday. Called Nicole today. She said she was in work and couldn't talk, no problem. I went to the coffee shop and waited for her lunch break. We drank coffee and talked. She really is great. We have the same taste in music and movies, and most things. I felt ready to tell her about my appointments with Dr. Chen, reassuring her I'm not dangerous or anything, I just did a stupid thing. She was so understanding, I felt like a huge weight was lifted off my shoulders when she smiled her beautiful smile at me and said she looked for a counselor herself after a car accident a couple of years ago, and thinks counseling is really helpful, but that she's never heard of Dr. Chen. Turns out she's into some alternative therapies too. Whatever, it's cool. Day 6, Sunday. Spent the day with Nicole. Was supposed to work on a college assignment, whatever. Nicole is more important to me right now. We shared a lot. I explained a bit about my frustration issues and some of the angry outbursts. She seemed cool with it. She's so awesome. She gave me a little clay creature thing. I called it a gargoyle and she said it is actually called a grotesque. It is an ugly little bastard, but she says it will protect me if I keep it in my dorm room. She has one too, a pale, goblin-looking thing, made out of cool white stone. It is much creepier. I'm planning to tell Dr. Chen about it. I reckon it will be right up her street. The hairs on my arms and neck stood up as waves of goose pimples ran across my body when I read this light and cheerful entry. In the really bad days at the end, I remember Pat mumbling to himself about the grotesque. Just the word itself still sends a shudder down my spine. Day 7, Monday. Dr. Chen totally approves of the grotesque. She recommended I keep it in my room, and that I talk to it, telling it my worries and what is making me angry. I think it is to give me something to vent at when I'm not calm enough to write in this journal. It sounded pretty hippy-dippy. But when Nicole texted me earlier this evening to say she wasn't feeling well and didn't want to hang out tonight, I talked to the little clay creature about how that upset me, and afterwards I felt oddly better. I wonder if Nicole talks to hers too. Day 8, Tuesday. Nicole wasn't feeling well today. Reckons it is the start of flu or something, and didn't meet me for lunch. I decided to go over to her apartment and bring her some food and flu remedies from the pharmacy. I don't mind, just getting to see her is enough for me. In the supermarket I took much longer than I normally would, agonizing over which juice she might prefer and what would be the best soup to bring her. It felt so important to get everything perfect, because she is perfect. When I got to her building, I almost sprinted up the stairs to her 4th floor apartment. I had butterflies in my stomach waiting at the door. She answered wearing a dressing gown, her eyes looking a little watery and her nose was chapped a little red from tissues, but she still looked amazing. She said she didn't want to kiss me in case I caught her flu. I didn't care if I caught it. I'd catch plague for her. We watched TV and talked all afternoon into the evening. I asked her if she talks to her grotesque. She does. Day 9, Wednesday. Nicole wanted to spend the day in bed recovering from the flu. I spent the day with Jace and our friends Kenny and Chris. Went to game store, secondhand record store, talked a bit. Wonder when Nicole will be feeling better again. I texted her a couple of times and only got one reply. Hope she's okay. It might not sound like much, but that was the first day in what seemed like ages that I was able to convince Pat to come out with us for more than an hour or so. He didn't talk much and we all found that strange. He was never normally so quiet, and although he seemed alive with energy, so much so it seemed as though his body twitched with the effort to contain it. Nothing seemed to interest him for more than a couple of seconds. It was like he just didn't care, that there was something preying on his mind driving him to distraction. We were all worried and told him so, but he shrugged it off. Day 10, Thursday. Nicole is feeling better. I went round early and we had breakfast together. I offered to cancel my appointment with Dr. Chen this afternoon so we could spend more time together. But she said she needed to go into work after taking those days off sick. This kind of annoyed me. I'm willing to make sacrifices in my life to put her first, but she doesn't seem willing to do the same. I went to my session. Today Dr. Chen talked about releasing rage. She said anger was like a poison and it was better out than in. She explained that people have a misguided view and that controlling your anger means you are disciplined. But in actual fact, people who can find the focus of their rage and direct it accurately can channel untapped power beyond anything they've ever done. It's when anger spills out all over the place that things get messy. That makes sense to me. I had to admit that this is not what I expected from counseling. Day 11/12, Friday night, Saturday. I'm not really in the mood to write an update. Went out tonight with Nicole to a party. Was excited to introduce her to my friends. Everything was fine at first. Jason didn't seem impressed. I thought he'd be supportive of my new relationship. I'm really happy with Nicole. Everyone else thought she was great, of course. In fact, I think a few guys were a little too friendly with her. In fact, I'm sure they were trying to flirt with her. Was she flirting back? I don't know. I had to leave before Jason could notice and rub it in my face. He's just jealous because I found the perfect girl. He'll try to pick it apart. He made fun of me when I told him I felt something really special for Nicole. I can't give him a chance to prove he was right for not taking me seriously. I love Nicole. I honestly have no idea where he got the idea that I would try to pick his relationship apart. I was happy for Pat. A little concerned for him, sure, but Nicole seemed really nice and I was pleased for them both. He had seemed on edge that night. Didn't drink much, didn't socialize much. Nicole was being friendly, chatting to a bunch of us, guys and girls. I didn't notice her flirt with anyone. But at around midnight, he pulled her to one side. I heard them having a hushed but agitated conversation and they abruptly left. It hurts me imagining Pat saw me as someone who would resent his newfound happiness. That must have been why he was so resistant to the help I tried to offer him later on. Day 13, Sunday. Feel shitty. Last entry was in the early hours of day 12 after that party. Waste of time. My friends are all idiots. I fell asleep as afternoon was approaching and slept the day away at Nicole's apartment. It is so wonderful being in bed next to her. She was a bit upset that I'd wanted to leave the party early the other night, but I explained that I just wasn't comfortable and she accepted it. She's so understanding. I felt immediately better once we were alone. We lay in bed as we normally do, with me spooning her soft, slim frame, one arm draped around her waist, holding her hand tightly. I feel so safe there, so calm. Day 14, Monday. Met Jason at class today. He didn't meet my eye. I suddenly felt a stab of guilt for being such a jerk to him the other night. I apologized. He said it was cool. I didn't explain everything to him though, just in case. I had another appointment with Dr. Chen this afternoon. She asked me if I was acting on my anger, but acting appropriately. I said I thought so. She said I must offer kindness to those who deserve it, instead of wasting love on ingrates. When walked in open territory, bother no one. If someone bothers me, ask him to stop. If he does not stop, destroy him. Kind of strange advice. It kind of makes sense though. Day 15, Tuesday. I can't stand living in the dorms anymore. The constant noise of other people's music, their footsteps, muffled conversation reverberating through the walls, it's driving me crazy. I can't switch off anymore. There's no silence. No peace to be had anywhere in these buildings. I've been talking to my grotesque. I've named him Chen after Dr. Chen. And it really seems to help to have a face to vent to, even if it is an ugly one. I think I'm going to ask Nicole if I can stay with her for a while. Day 16, Wednesday. I stayed last night with Nicole. It was great. I feel so comfortable around her. I feel like there's this wire coil wound tightly in my chest all the time. But when I'm with her, it unwinds and I can relax. I didn't bring little Chen with me. He's still on the shelf in my dorm room. I've heard Nicole whispering to her little goblin creature sometimes. It is pretty cute. The whispering, not the grotesque. Unlike the one she gave me, which looks like a cartoon gnome, hers is truly hideous. Actually quite scary despite its tiny size. It has this wide, flat head and lantern jaw, bristling with what looks like a row of shark's teeth. Its body is gaunt and elongated, arched into an awkward crouch. It has no nose and all of its skin is smooth and white. Wait, what am I talking about? Skin? I mean, what it is made of is entirely white. Apart from its eyes, they are small and beady and totally black. I don't know how she can take comfort from that, but she seems to tell it everything. We didn't see Pat for several days from this point on. I will just paste his entries as I read them, as there is no further explanation of the next few days that I can offer, and for that I apologize. Day 17, Thursday. I got a text from my friend Jessica this morning. Nicole saw it on my phone and asked who Jessica was. No, not asked, demanded. I explained Jessica was just a friend wanting to know how I was because I'd been missing a few classes recently. I don't know if Nicole believed me or not. I'm hurt, genuinely. I don't know why she would mistrust me. Haven't I given her every single reason to have faith in my feelings for her? I talked to Dr. Chen about it at my session this afternoon. She says being quick to suspicion can be a sign of a guilty conscience. Could Nicole have something to hide? Day 18, Friday. I'm positive now. Nicole isn't being entirely honest with me. I don't even know if she shares my feelings. She has been less and less talkative, sort of irritable. I asked her if it was her time of the month and she told me not to be so fucking sexist. I don't know what her problem is. She's been talking to her grotesque again and texting on her phone a lot. She gives me a dirty look when I look at my phone. I think she might be cheating on me. I walked into her living room earlier this evening and she closed the windows on her laptop really quickly. She's hiding something. Day 19, Saturday. Had to go to a catch-up class today because I've been missing so many lectures. I woke up this morning feeling heavy. I didn't sleep well. My dreams are chaotic. A lunatic showreel of discordant sounds and images. I seem to expel more energy asleep than awake. Regardless, I still had to drag my sorry ass into class this afternoon. Nicole went to work. She hardly said goodbye this morning. I'm sure she's cheating on me, but maybe with her manager at work? I don't know. But I know she's hiding something from me. Class today was pointless. I didn't absorb anything. I couldn't focus my mind. Is it any wonder? I could hardly hear the lecture over the sounds of people breathing, whispering, the scratching of pens against paper, the rattling click of keyboards, the humming of the heating system, footsteps in the halls outside of the classroom, the shuffling of bodies in their seats, their clothes rustling, people clearing their throats, sighing. I swear I could practically hear their hearts beating. My head hurts. Walking back to Nicole's apartment in the early evening, I felt like the shadows lengthened faster than normal for this time of year, as if they were reaching out to touch me as I hurried along the quiet streets. I didn't see anyone around, but I felt watched. I'm starting to wish she lived nearer to the college, or at least a busier side of town. She still isn't home. She should have finished work over an hour ago. What is she up to? Day 20, Sunday. I'm at the end of my chain with Nicole. When I confronted her last night about where she had been for hours after her work had finished, she just brushed my question aside as if it didn't matter. When I pushed the issue, she snapped at me. Said she'd gone to a bar called Catalan with a friend after work. Said she was tired of me always wanting to stay in on the weekends, not letting her have any fun. I asked her what friend, a guy friend? She said, so what if it was? I don't get her. Why is she acting like this? I have done everything I can for her, and now she is treating me like I don't even matter. Doesn't she understand the only reason I don't want to go out anymore is because I want to protect her? To be alone with her? Because I love her? She refused to discuss things any further, went to bed without me. That's what she does when she wants to end a discussion. She just goes to bed, ignores me if I follow her and keep talking. I don't know what to do. I followed her to work today. I know she only went in on a Sunday to avoid me. I sat in my car across the street from the coffee shop all damn day. Nicole seemed so casual, bright, and carefree. I could tell she wasn't even thinking about her fight last night. When her manager came out around lunchtime, she was all smiles. He was leaning over her shoulder as she was writing something behind the register. He was way too close and she seemed so comfortable with it. That settles it. I know she's fucking him. Day 21, Monday. I didn't go to my appointment with Dr. Chen today. She never calls if I don't show up. It's like it doesn't make a difference. I don't know why I'm still even writing this journal, but weirdly it does seem to help clear my mind. I can get things straight when I write them down. I feel like my brain is full of static right now. After seeing Nicole cozying up to that guy yesterday, I decided to follow her after work in my car. The coffee shop closed at the usual time, and sure enough, she left with him. They got a cab to the bar Nicole had mentioned the other night, Catalan. It looked like a cheap tapas and beers place. A lot of tacky red lights around the entrance. I didn't follow them inside. Just sat in my car and stared at those bright red lights. Even through the glass of my car windows, I felt as though I could almost hear, even feel the buzzing of the electrical fuses inside those crimson bulbs. The vivid, constant brilliance of those red lights seared into my mind, mocking me with the knowledge that just past their glow was the woman I loved, and another man, doing God knows what in that tacky low-rent bar. I could feel my heart thumping in my chest, my breathing becoming raspy. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. The buzz of the electric light was drowned out now as I could hear my pulse bounding in my inner ears. I was aware of all these things clearly enough to consciously take note of them in my mind, but didn't seem able to snap out of it. I felt sick with anger, jealousy, betrayal. I wanted to know how she could do this, what I had done to deserve this kind of treatment. But at the same time, I didn't care to hear any explanation, any empty apologies. I wanted her to know how much she was hurting me. I don't remember much after that. I think I must have driven back to Nicole's apartment and slept on the couch. That is where I woke up. After a quick glance into the still, dark bedroom, I saw that she had come home and gone to bed without me again. It was then that I realized I wasn't wearing the same jeans and shirt I had on yesterday. I had changed at some point last night. I also had a headache, and my mouth tasted gross. I couldn't remember when I'd done when I got back to the apartment. Checking the kitchen though, sure enough there was an almost empty bottle of Jameson's on the counter, and in the washing machine were my clothes from the previous night. Still wet from washing. I then had a terrible thought. Had I been so jealous of what I'd seen last night that I decided to go out myself, get drunk and cheat on Nicole? I remember a while back when I cheated on this girl I'd been dating. We hadn't had anything special, but I still wanted to avoid the drama of getting caught. So I'd washed all my clothes from the previous night before she came over to guarantee there would be no lipstick marks or telltale smells of perfume on my clothes from the other chick. I went to the bathroom to take a piss and brush the rank taste of the night before out of my mouth. I glanced into the mirror over the sink and noticed a few red marks on my cheek and neck. Oh fuck. I must have hooked up with some chick. I have entirely no memory of who though. The marks were a bright crimson red, a color way too slutty to be Nicole's lipstick. They reminded me of the glow of the red lights outside Bar Catalan. My whole mind seemed to be filled with red right now. It hurts my head. I'm pretty sure Nicole figured out what I did last night, and that is why she's ignoring me. Oh fuck. Day 22, Tuesday. Jace called me this morning and insisted I come out and meet him. I didn't want to, but Nicole still isn't speaking to me. She is just lying in bed and wouldn't even respond when I tried to talk to her. Her little grotesque figurine isn't on the dresser where it normally is. She must have taken it to bed with her to talk about what I did. I think she is really upset with me. If she has figured out that I cheated on her, I'm not surprised. How could I have been such a moron? Anyway, I couldn't stand sitting in the apartment in silence. TV hurts my head, and I can't concentrate enough to make a start on any of the huge pile of neglected college work I've left sitting on a coffee table. So I met up with Jace. None of our other friends were there, which I was kind of grateful about. Jace kept giving me weird, freaky looks out of the corner of his eye, like he expected me to burst into flames or something. He seemed totally on edge around me. I don't get it. I tried to explain a little about what was going on, but he didn't seem to follow any of what I was telling him, even though I'm sure I was explaining it as clearly as possible. It was like we were talking in different languages. After a couple of hours, he said he had to get back to his dorm. He had an assignment to do, but insisted that if I needed to talk again, I just had to text or call. Sure, Jace, I'll call if I need to talk to someone who will just give me creeped out looks and hardly respond. Thanks a lot. Now, here's where I feel the need to jump in and again provide a little dose of reality. I remember that day with Pat as clear as crystal. I should too, as it was the last time he and I spent any time together. I did not think I was acting strangely toward him, and if I was, I am sincerely sorry that I made him feel he couldn't talk to me. But you need to understand, he was rambling gibberish. Most of what he said was just broken sentences. Paranoia and resentment leaking through between the nonsense. He was jumpy, and that made me jumpy. He wouldn't maintain eye contact, and when I was talking to him, he'd appear to be listening and then suddenly whirl around to stare behind him, and he'd realize he'd actually been totally ignoring you, listening out for something. Eventually I couldn't take it anymore. I made my excuse and left. I really meant it when I told him to call or text though. Of course, he never did. Day 23, Wednesday. I'm starting to feel like this journal is the only place I can talk about what is going on in my life. I don't feel safe talking to anyone. Not my friends, not Dr. Chen. I've decided not to return to my sessions with her. It was after I started that so-called counseling that all of this shit started to happen. She hasn't been in touch since I stopped attending either. And I realize I don't even have a phone number for her. Whatever. Nicole still won't say a damn word to me. I think she is depressed. She hasn't got out of bed the whole time I've been here. I went out for a walk earlier to try and clear my mind. Just a brief one though, as the streets around here seem kind of shadier than normal to me. She must have gotten up while I was out and then gone back to bed. I feel so alone, and yet somehow watched. The shadows in the apartment seem darker than is natural. I've begun to dread sunset. Daylight seems to be my only friend. As soon as night comes and I have to rely on electric light, I am tortured by the buzzing of the fuses, and I swear the lights dim and flicker as and when they choose. It creates more shadows than is necessary, and not just in shades of gray. As I sit here and write this, I'm convinced that just out of the corner of my eye, there's a darkness that is much too dark, blacker than anything found in nature, the kind of pitch that comes from a shadow concealing something. I know that if I stare directly into it, my eyes will eventually focus, revealing nothing. But for some reason, I cannot force myself to turn and look. My spine is frozen, because if I do turn, I will have shown fear, and whatever is watching me, whatever it is, will know I am scared. Day 25, Friday. It has started watching me during the day now. I can't even sleep on the couch with the blinds drawn and sunlight pouring into the living room. I am still watched. Nicole acts as though I don't exist, just lying in bed, not responding to anything I say. I pace her apartment, trying to relieve some of the frustration and anxiety I'm beginning to feel crushed beneath. The guilt, the confusion, the fear. I know she knows what I did, and I know she told that fucking grotesque creature. I don't know where it is. It is still missing from its spot on the dresser. I can see most of the bedside table from the bedroom door, even in the half light, and it isn't there either. I'm beginning to feel convinced that it is the presence I can sense watching me, following me with its dreadful beady eyes. I can see, or perhaps feel, the outline of its hideous deformed features in the shadows, in the corners of every room. Its bony contorted form disappearing just behind a turn in the corridor, or evaporating from view in the crack of a door left ajar. Always there, always gone as soon as I get it within my line of sight. And although the figurine has only ever been a few inches high, I swear it is growing, feeding on my fear. I can smell it too. This foul odor has begun to gradually taint the whole apartment. It is trying to drive me insane with anxiety and exhaustion. It is punishing me for hurting Nicole. Day 26, Saturday. I cried today. Cried the agonized, hysterical tears of despair. Nicole will not talk to me, but I cannot bring myself to approach her in bed, to demand a response, to shake her violently until she looks at me. I am too ashamed, too crippled with my own self-loathing that I am the one who, through my own selfish actions, pushed her into a depression so deep she cannot move from her bed. I still have not slept. I barely closed my eyes for more than a fraction of a second. I can't afford to let my guard down. It is getting closer. The grotesque has grown overnight. Yesterday it was a flicker, a silhouette, never taller than the natural extended shadow of the figurine. It would sneak behind corners and watch me with its empty black eyes, its rancid sweet stink wafting in and filling my nostrils, burning my throat. Today its smell is filling the apartment, but I did not see it all day. I stayed in the sunlight, the rays warming my skin and banishing excess shadows, but not calming me. I haven't eaten in several days. Haven't been able to eat. It is making me weak. While in the comparative safety of the sunlight, I went into the kitchen and tried to eat a sandwich. It tasted hardly of anything. Swallowing was difficult. The muscles in my throat didn't seem to want to cooperate. After gulping down a glass of water to try and flush the food into my stomach, I was overcome with nausea. I sprinted to the bathroom and dropped to my knees, hugging the cold porcelain bowl. The rough chunks of my only meal for 3 days forcing their way back up my gullet. The water I drank still cold as it flooded my mouth and splashed into the toilet. After spitting a couple of times and clearing my throat, I got shakily back to my feet. I turned on the cold water in the sink and washed my face. As I straightened up and looked into the bathroom mirror, I felt my heart lurch in my chest. I blinked and it was gone, but there was no denying that for a sliver of a fraction of a second, there was the figure of the grotesque behind me, just outside the bathroom door. Its crooked form stood taller than any human now, long limbs and pallid body crouching almost double under the confines of my apartment's ceiling. Its low-slung jaw gaping wide, revealing the vicious, jagged teeth of no earthly creature. Its cavernous mouth, like a black hole into oblivion waiting to swallow all living things. It seemed almost eyeless, only two slightly shining points in its huge, warped, waxy head, no iris or pupils to follow. But there was no question that it was staring directly at me. Before my brain could comprehend the instinctive terror of the prey searing through my body, like shards of ice piecing outward from my heart, it was gone again. I stood there motionless, breathless, for what seemed like an eternity before I had the courage to peer, trembling, into the corridor to see nothing. The smell of it is overpowering now. I could hardly breathe, but I still tried to beg for forgiveness from Nicole, in the hope that she would call the thing off. I approached her bedside. It was so dark. I reached my hand out to hold hers. All I felt was the cold, moist skin of the grotesque under my fingers, and I ran from the room feeling the shadows writhe around me. I know that to try and leave would only anger the thing more. Oh, please God, help me. Protect me from the vengeance of this creature. I am so sorry for what I have done. Do not let it punish me any further. Day 26, Saturday. I concede. I am a wreck. I am broken. The grotesque has won, and rightly so. Nicole told me that she told it everything, that it would protect her. It has seen inside of me. Its hollow eyes have violated my very soul, and it has found me unworthy of her. I am doomed by my own actions. It will never let me leave. She will not leave her bed. I cannot leave this apartment. Even if someone comes to find us, I am beyond help now. That was the last entry posted in the journal. From the date on it, I could see that it was 6 days before the police eventually broke down the door to Nicole's apartment. A neighbor had complained of a foul smell seeping under the door and through the walls, and her manager at the coffee shop, who she was clearly friendly with, began asking in the building if anyone knew where she was. Eventually, someone called the police. Pat's parents were called, obviously, and they called me, I suppose, for moral support as we had been best friends, and we visited him in the hospital. The police said that upon forcing the door of the apartment, they had been hit with a wave of sickening putrid air, and they had found Pat curled up in the corner of the living room, unwashed and half-starved, every light in the apartment switched on. He was mumbling to himself, his eyes wide and roaming around the walls, seemingly unaware of the police intrusion until they tried to help him to his feet. Whereupon he began thrashing wildly, screaming, not to be punished. This had confused them at first, until they continued their sweep of the apartment and entered the bedroom, which it was obvious was the source of the horrific and overpowering smell. Swinging the door inward as a massive cloud of flies was disturbed and filled the air, landing on the walls and ceiling, forming pulsating black shadows. Approaching the bed, they saw what appeared to be a figure asleep, until someone switched on the overhead light. It was the body of Nicole, at an advanced stage of decomposition, her flesh near liquefied and saturating the bedsheets. Her dark brown hair was a tangled mess spread over the pillow, swept back to reveal the obvious cause of death: blunt force trauma to the skull. The entire right side of her head caved in, with what appeared to be a small but heavy white stone figurine. She had apparently put up something of a fight as her fingernails were split from clawing at her attacker. The cream-colored wallpaper was stained a brownish red, with huge splatter marks of now crumbling congealed blood. She had obviously been struck several times with the ornament. Pat was immediately arrested and taken directly to the hospital. I felt utterly useless sitting in the uncomfortable plastic chair, under the fluorescent hospital lighting, looking at the figure strapped to the bed. I didn't recognize him. I could hardly understand a word he said. I picked out Red and Grotesque, that's about it. I wasn't going to be any help to his parents or the police. I told them everything I could, but I don't think it amounted to much. Someone had tried to find contact details of the Dr. Chen I informed them Pat was seeing, but there was no listed phone number, and nobody could find any records of a counselor or therapist locally under that name. She seemed to have disappeared, if she ever existed in the first place. Since nobody else ever saw her, it now seems entirely possible she was just a figment of what was turning out to be Pat's very fractured mind. As far as anyone could tell, Pat had gone insane with jealousy, bludgeoned Nicole to death that night after she got home from the bar. Whether he was already drunk when he killed her, that was up for debate. But he had certainly gotten drunk and either before or afterward, proceeded to wash his bloodstained clothes and cut off all contact with the outside world, convincing himself she was just sleeping. Even now, he didn't seem to be aware of what he had done, concerned more about being punished or pursued by some creature. Initially, police and doctors had assumed his impassioned pleas not to be punished were directed at the authorities in relation to his crime. It is only now that I begin to hear them, echoing in my head in an entirely different context. The press obviously got wind of the bizarre nature of the incident, and by the second night, Pat was under observation. There were a couple of reporters loitering in the hospital lobby. I had ducked by them pretty quickly, but glancing back saw that Pat's parents weren't as quick and had been cornered. I felt the painful lump in my throat as I saw their faces, twisted in confusion and grief, as they were bombarded with questions. I began to walk back to try and offer some kind of distraction to the reporters, so that perhaps Pat's mother and father could slip away unnoticed. "Is it true he smashed her head in with a gargoyle?" cruelly demanded one of the reporters, pushing forward a recorder. "No," I interrupted before Pat's father had a chance to tell the reporter to fuck off, or even take a deserving swipe at the man's head. I think it's called a grotesque. To my knowledge, the object is still sitting in an evidence locker somewhere. Though I know it had no power in itself, I can't help but take some comfort in the knowledge that it is locked away forever. As a civil inspector in Ohio, I spent most of my time scouring overpasses and government building projects. If there was a fault on a foundation or an oversight on a public blueprint, it was my job to sniff it out. The work was dull but straightforward, and I liked it that way. I wouldn't get rich, but the position was comfortable, and I could leave my house each morning secure in the knowledge that today would be much like yesterday. That comfort was stolen from me in the spring of 2019 by Cincinnati's derelict subway tunnels, and I haven't worked a day in civil inspection since. In the early morning hours of March 3rd, a tiptoeing earthquake rattled windows in Georgetown, a small community along the Kentucky border. It was so subtle that most residents weren't roused from sleep. A passing shudder of this table or that floor lamp, all that spoke to the creeping seismic activity beneath the soil. Generally, this wouldn't have meant anything to a Cincinnati-based civil inspector living 40 miles away, but cruel circumstance would make it my problem. Someone associated with the city government, whose home was along the Brighton Avenue, started raising stink about a dip in the roadway that jolted the passing traffic. Supposedly, the problem was a sudden development. The word about the tiny Georgetown tremor reached Cincinnati, and suddenly every voice in local government was ablaze with references to structural stability, theorizing about sunken ground or displaced earth. The long-abandoned, half-completed subway system beneath the city ran right under Brighton, which only served to throw more fuel on the fire. Despite the fact there had been no measurable tremors in Cincinnati, It was fast decided by people with frayed nerves and few wits that an inspection was needed. No one wanted to be the one who was fingered for doing nothing if anything went wrong. So dollars would have to be spent to see if a minuscule earthquake had managed to shatter several feet of concrete from 40 miles away. When straws were drawn to see who would get that not-so-illustrious job, my name came up. Though I didn't see any reason to justify the city's worry, I wasn't about to turn down burning through a paid afternoon strolling an empty tunnel for my wages. I've tried to work out an excuse I could have used to escape that ill-fated patrol, but there was no way for me to know what lay in store for me. In my mind, this was yet another case of an easy day for easy pay, and I make it my habit not to question easy pay. The day started out innocuous enough. Sunny, unseasonably warm, relatively quiet. I took the keys I'd been given to the large, gated entrance near I-75. The rumble of passing traffic muffling any reservations I might have about the tunnel that waited beyond. Only when the large metal doors swung shut behind me and the roaring traffic dwindled to a stifled drone did I feel apprehension. There are two parallel tracks making up the larger portion of the completed tunnels, separated by a large central concrete wall. The wall is punctuated here and there with cramped 6-foot-high access passages, meant to give maintenance crews the ability to slip from one to the other on foot. There was very little actual railway though, the money having dried up far before the final stages of construction. Even the graffiti felt old and outmoded, for the city had stepped up security at the locked entrances 2 decades ago in the interest of safety, much to the chagrin of wandering teenagers and cold homeless residents, I'm sure. Light spilled in from the metal grate above the doors at my back, but was fast swallowed by the yawning mouth of the tunnel ahead. The noise of each breath I took seemed to cascade down, its darkened interior like applause, amplifying each rise and fall, each scuffle of my hands against denim as I raised a flashlight from my belt and banished a bit of the shadow. My first step sent a stray stone skipping along the time-stained concrete and, foolish as I knew it was, my heart leapt at the sound. I forced myself to move forward, keeping myself distracted by scouring the ceiling for cracks or degradation in the roof, and scanning the paint-spattered walls for signs of failure. But I never quite got comfortable. Each footstep sent ripples of sound through the dark. Rats scampered the floor at the edges of my sight, fleeting shadows within the shadow. And their muffled pattering seemed almost deafening to me. Though I had no reason to fear, I became conscious of the fact that I was trying to minimize the noise, almost tiptoeing through the tunnel. My eyes constantly darted for those gaping black passageways in the dividing wall that led to the adjacent track, as if I expected to catch movement of the obscure tunnel beyond. I never saw anything but the wriggling shapes of rodents, aside from the almost imperceptible rumble of distant trucks overhead. I heard no human sound save my own in the subway. Perhaps it was this paradoxical loneliness beneath the bustling city that made me feel like such an invader, I told myself. Gradually, a station opened up before me, with the dividing wall between the tracks dying away and the platforms rising up to either side. Stairways disappeared into solid concrete ceilings, filled in the better part of a century ago when the city ceased production. I felt a bit better here, somehow less threatened in the open expanse of the derelict station. It was a far cry from the confined tunnels and the mental images of lurking figures, conjured up by that barren dividing wall. I clambered up onto the nearest platform, the largest in the station, and scanned the steadfast walls, finding little of note save the preponderance of genitalia amongst the graffiti. There was no sign of wear and tear, the old construction having been built to last. I tapped it with my knuckles absently as I moved along, a barely audible tribute to the last century's engineers, who had built such an underappreciated and indestructible bunker. Again, it struck me just how silly the trip down here had been. My eyes found a sort of ratty clothes heap across the tracks, then just a vague silhouette in the distant darkness. I made my way across to the opposing platform, curious as to what had been left behind in the urban tomb after all these years. As it moved into view, I saw mounted blankets and twisted jackets, matted and filthy with neglected age. I saw a low ring of old bricks, the bones of a makeshift fire pit which hadn't hosted wood in ages. Finally, I saw the beaten old steno pad off to the side, stained and dog-eared, and the haphazard writing sprawled across its pages. I don't know exactly what compelled me to take up the little pad and start to flip through. I had already decided that my task was pointless, so I'm sure a little boredom played a role. I had hours to burn down there, and I wasn't about to find a gaping chasm in the roof. Regardless, I began to read. As I went, what little comfort I took in the open space of the subway station slowly trickled away. An ink aged so greatly by exposure to the predations of vermin and temperature that its flow was almost lost. The first few pages of stilted, aggressive penmanship tell of how the writer had ended up alone in the tunnels. By his account, the writer had dwelt there for many years, with a group of vagrants during the 80s and 90s. When authorities had warned the squatters that the tunnels would soon be locked off, he had stubbornly opted to hide in the deepest portion of the ruins, evading notice while the rest packed what little they had and moved on. When the barriers clanged shut, he'd crept back to his accustomed spot on the platform, determined to either survive on a combined diet of stolen canned goods and trapped rat, or die in his own terms in the tunnels. There was only cursory information about what led to his presence there, however. Apparently, he had only begun writing at all because he believed someone else to be in the tunnels with him, and suspected they were rifling through his camp while he was away. He frequently addresses whoever's banging around in the main tunnel at night, or the man in the tunnel, with the ending to his introductory pages reading, "If you're sitting in my camp reading this while I scrounge for rats near their entrance, do yourself a favor and either make yourself known, or keep to your part of the subway. I have a gun on me, and it'd be a bad idea to spook me at night." Several entries, perhaps made each day, detail how the man in the tunnel continues to scatter stones before going quiet at odd hours of the night, or mumble not quite right words he can't decipher which echo around the subway system. The speech was described as sounding deaf, as if the speaker were slightly mistaken and atonal but couldn't detect the difference. Never could he catch a glimpse of this person. The one weak flashlight he had on him couldn't reach far down the tunnel, and his unwanted guest always seemed to go silent as soon as the rider was awakened or alerted by the noise. Then comes the fourth entry when things get very eerie. An old cat who had come down to the tunnels through a tiny grate to hunt rats and poke around his camp, dubbed Ollie by the writer, had been missing for the day of the prior entry. The writer had taken to calling for him whenever he came into the tunnels or got up from his perch on the platform to stretch his legs. When on that second day the writer finally managed to drift off, he was awakened by faint, distant calling from far off down the tunnels. Again, he described it as slightly off, as if spoken over chewed food. He swears in the notebook that the voice was calling Ollie over and over, in much the same tone and rhythm that he had called the name before. He laments in the entry that he had no way of contacting the world beyond the subway gates, and mentions that he is going to attempt staying awake for the next couple of days, perhaps now writing more for his own security of mind than for his assumed visitor. Though I can't know how long passes between the penultimate entry and the final, strange encounter described in the last pages. I believe it to be no more than a day later given its phrasing and flow. The writer, apparently dazed by lack of sleep in front of the small fire he'd made on the platform, and rocking back and forth to keep awake, was surprised by a noise just above him. from the ceiling of the platform, on edge and holding the small revolver he carried in his lap. He raised the weapon almost reflexively and saw outlined by the fire what he describes as some big-ass, pale, naked guy hanging from the ceiling. The person, though I think thing might be the better term, was looking down at him and was moving to climb to the floor when he shot it. It wailed, a sound he describes as wet and weird. The thing then dropped to the floor and skidded with inhuman speed off the platform and down the tunnel, disappearing before he could stand to line up another shot. It was something the homeless population in the tunnels had called the Long Man, the writer said, a kind of tall tale the oldest of them used to tell. He'd always assumed it was hearsay like the others. Maybe it had been there all along, he speculated, becoming bold when the population of squatters fell to just one lonely soul. Heartened by the fact that he had heard whoever or whatever had been lurking in the tunnel, he records that he is going to follow the blood this long man left in the tunnel as it fled and see if he can't find and kill it. Then the journal ended. The nameless man who penned it in the dark lost the remaining empty pages. I sat there crouched in the dark corner of the ruins of the fire pit for some time, soaking in the story it told. I found myself throwing furtive glances across the platform to the looming tunnels, conscious of the occasional scuttling rat. This, I told myself, was an excellent bit of theatrical fiction. Whoever had written it left it here years back, in a place that was bound to put visitors on edge. There had been a real Lovecraft amongst the squatters in the station to have pulled that little tale off, I thought. As I tried to shake away my nerves and restore what little comfort I built up in the yawning subway station, I put the little notepad back down in its place. Fool that I was, I dismissed my worries, consigned the story to the world of fiction, and strode back to the tracks. Looking back on that return to the tunnels and the first steps along the route to the second station, I do think the story made an impression on me, whether I dismissed it or not. Each step upon the concrete was cautious and measured, and I took care to steer clear of broken glass or pooled water that might ring out beneath my tread. Distracting myself with observant glances at a roof I knew would yield no scars, I reassured myself that it was only a couple miles until the end of the line. Then it'd be back to the surface to tell the city where it could shove its earthquake theory of pothole development. The shadows seemed deeper and the rats seemed more numerous, my mind reading foreboding menace where I assured myself there was none. Much as I told myself I was being foolish, I couldn't make myself calm down entirely. I almost made to whistle or mutter to myself, just to break the silence and prove myself a fool. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. I just kept my head down and moved along. It was only when I came into view of the second stop along the tunnel that I was given pause. Somewhere in the gloom up ahead, barely captured beneath the waving beam of my light, a snap of motion caught my eye, just visible across the intervening 100 yards or so. In a flash, it sank behind an intervening concrete pillar and out of view near the farther tunnels. I froze, processing the motion, my head spinning as I went through an animalistic on-the-spot internal debate over whether to cut out the light and try to hide. Though it had only been visible for a moment, I could have sworn the thing that moved was ahead, lurching backward out of view. It took me a moment to gather myself, but I was emboldened rather than frightened when I heard a stone clatter in the distant tunnel. I strode forward, light in hand, speaking for the first time since closing myself into the echoing vault. "Hey!" I shouted. "Whoever's up there, I'm not here to run you off." The words of my supervisor came to mind, a warning to watch out for vagrants in the tunnels. Suddenly my mind felt at ease, giving a familiar shape to the nervous tension I'd felt in the dark. I had no idea how a homeless resident would have found their way back in there. But perhaps I'd found the fiction writer from the prior platform. "I'm here to check for damage," I told the empty air, my voice amplified by the soaring arched ceilings. "I'll be in and out fast as can be." I moved out into the station, the echoes of my footfall once again deafening. I shined my light into the oncoming tunnel, but saw nothing save dust and distant darkness beneath the beam. I scanned the platforms and saw this junction was much as the same as the last, vacant and gaping. Only several trash heaps and scattered hunks of debris littered the ground, and the ceilings were as sturdy as they'd ever been. Again I called out to the darkness, and again no response came. I spent a moment debating whether to proceed, but ended up deciding against an early retreat from the tunnels. After all, I was familiar with the overpasses and derelict buildings of the city, and I was no stranger to squatters. If I didn't bother them, they wouldn't bother me. That's what I kept telling myself, at least. Forcing each step and scanning every aperture in the dividing wall between the tracks. There were more debris from construction here, with piles of pallets and bundled piping pressed up against the dingy walls. I made an effort not to pry too much, keeping my eyes forward, hoping whatever homeless person I'd spotted just sat tight and let me get my ill-advised rounds over with. I spoke now and then, laughing off the futility of the search for flaws in the structure, making sure I made my position known in the dark. "Stupid I'm even down here, really," I told the dusty, stifled air. "Managerial shit. Big waste of city dollars. What can you do, though?" The words were torrential in the confines of the subway, but I felt more secure. I wouldn't be sneaking up on anyone in here, and now that I was convinced there was an occupant, that was my best bet to keep the day simple and straightforward. I wasn't about to rock up on some spooked homeless guy in the dark. The more I thought about it, though, the more uncomfortable I became. As concrete as the simple idea of squatters had been, and as glad as I was for my apparent solitude in the tunnel, I couldn't reconcile one thing. The longer I walked, the more it gnawed at me. Until I slowed to a near crawl the better part of a mile from the second station. The last opened up before me, still and silent, and I halted the words of warning I'd been forming just as they began. Whoever it was, they'd never once used a light. I'd never seen a flash in the dark or a stray beam bouncing off pooled water. What kind of squatter didn't need light? I hesitated a moment, but then second-guessed myself. As I threw a cursory glance around the empty station, I shook my head, trying to dispel some of the nervous twitching I'd become accustomed to in the tunnel. There was nothing here, and there wasn't really anything left of the tunnel system. Right ahead, where the track should have continued, they terminated in a big cinder block and cement barrier that marked the end of a polished construction. If they weren't here, they weren't anywhere. I supposed I'd just taken an odd shadow or water-stained blotch on the wall for motion in the last station. I scoffed for an audience of no one, mocking my own hasty judgment, laughing it off like I hadn't just shit my way back down the last track. I pressed forward to the barrier, feeling I owed it to myself to at least check that before I turned to go. Then I could at least try to tell myself I'd been nonchalant down the subway. It was only when I drew near, high on the feeling of relief that had flooded me when I found the last station empty, that I grew nervous. In the lower right corner of the barrier, several of the large bricks had been dislodged and shoved free, bathed in the dust of intervening years. Through the hole trickled dingy, tepid water, pooling on the empty concrete of the station's tracks. It looked too old to be freshly made, I thought. No tiny earthquake could have shaken those stones loose, anyhow. I sloshed through the shallow water, dropping to a crouch before the gap, shining my light through in search of some kind of chasm or damage. I hoped to see only the mounded rock and poured concrete of the construction team's patch job, but I wasn't to be so fortunate. Beyond, the ground grew rough, hewn rock and jagged stone over which a slow, sickly stream bubbled. It ran through a little tunnel no more roomy than a crawl space, bubbling up from some cold spring beneath the ground. It was the first real sign of wear and tear I'd seen down here, but it left me with far more questions than answers. The tunnel had apparently been plotted with the aim to steer clear of the river. The construction must have grazed a subterranean spring, I wagered, perhaps without the notice of the original planners. The years had done the rest, eating through a path towards the derelict barrier. The water would have had to work fast, though. Could it even have carved the little creek bed that quickly? And how in the world had it shifted to cinder blocks off the wall? Perhaps there was a homeless resident in the tunnels, I reasoned. He'd broken the wall in search of water, maybe having heard the murmur of the stream from the station. I nodded to myself, working it out in my head. Then, at the end of my vision, something moved at the rear of the spring-fed stream. Just above the waterline, emerging from whatever crevice in the stone was vomiting forth the sour water. The beam of my light caught shine which had not been there on the initial scan. From 3 grayish-white shapes poking up from the water, 6 golden reflections stared back, twitching in the harsh glow of my light. Eyes. They were too broad to be a man's, too reflective in the dark. I stumbled back when they blinked out, the owners having flinched away from the beam. Raccoons or big rats, I tried to tell myself, rising to my feet and putting a few more yards between myself and the hole. That rationalization didn't stop me from pulling the cheap little utility knife from my belt, grasping it so tightly in my free hand that my nails drew blood from my palm. They'd have to have been very, very large raccoons. Moreover, the pale shapes in the water had been wrong, rounded and broad, too much like a person's skull. I made for the far tunnels, throwing a few shaky glances over my shoulder toward the gap, though I was still busy trying to convince myself I'd been spooked by animals on the one hand. Other parts of my brain calculated the distance to the far exit. I'd cursed that I'd been given a key only for the one gate, and lacked the keys for other access doors built near the stations. It was when I reached the other end of the station that I heard a slight, subdued vocalization from behind me, only reverberating to my ears due to the vaulted construction overhead. In a shaken, awkward tone that brought to mind the faded pages of the filthy stenopad, a twisted parody of the words, "What can you do?" echoed out into the tunnels. The words were without inflection or emphasis, clearly organic but spoken with all the mood of a text-to-speech device. They were all wrong. The words of a child phonetically reading out a sentence they couldn't understand. There was no tenderness or clumsy comedy in them, though. Only cold, detached interest. I ran, not yet daring to look back. I made it perhaps 100 yards down the tunnel when, just as I began to believe I'd be left alone, there was a clamor farther back along the tracks. Though it took me a moment to place it over the noise of my booted footfalls in the stifled darkness, I eventually deciphered the noise. The slap of many bare feet upon concrete. My pace quickened, pressing me to the limit of my physical ability. I cursed that I let myself slip out of shape, damning myself with weekends off spent lounging around at home with a book in hand. But the adrenaline helped push me along. Only when I could hear the nameless things gaining in the dark did I make a gamble. Without slowing my pace, I dug through one of the holes in the dividing wall. I hoped beyond hope that whatever was close on my heels hadn't fanned out in both tunnels. I flicked off my light as I crossed on shaky legs to the far wall, cautiously feeling my way into a crevice between the concrete and some stacked, filthy wooden pallets, and held my breath. The fleshy sound of the footsteps swept past down the other tunnel. half muffled by the intervening wall. They were as odd as the voice had been, unlike the rhythm of a regular sprinter, as if every few steps were punctuated by leaps or scuttling crouches. Imagination did the work my shadow-blinded eyes could not in the all-consuming gloom, giving twisted forms to the capering horde as they wound further away down the track. Though my initial mood was relief, it was not to last. First, I thought of escape. With only one exit available to me, I felt cornered. The things now between me and the distant exit. Even if they'd pass me by for now, what chance did I have of slipping past whatever those watchers in the stream were in the dark? There were more immediate threats, though. Only a heart-rattled minute or two after their passage, a noise reached back to me from where the mob had run. A sort of sonorous clicking, like a tongue off the roof of the mouth. It echoed down the tunnels and, after a brief pause, was answered. No echo could muddle the fact that the responder was frightfully close in the dark. Perhaps 20 feet off. The most disconcerting thing, though, was that the noise came from above. Again, it sounded. Many such noises joined in. Most were distant and scattered, but the one nearest to me was methodical, purposeful. It shifted from one side of the tunnel to the other, unseen limbs scraping across stone with cautious, barely audible grace. I stifled each breath, ears strained, every hair on my body standing on end as I braced for whatever came next. It came lower, clicking all the while. I recall thinking it had to be directly above me, on the wall of the tunnel I huddled against. I froze as best I could, restraining a jolt of fright as some tiny fragment of stone or debris was dislodged in the dark and clattered to the ground beside my arm. There was one final click, loud as thunder to my ears, then silence. What came after happened in a flash, but my experience of it is sticky and slow, stretched wide by tension. I waited for a breathless eternity, expecting each moment a miraculous resumption of the clicking which never came. My knuckles must have been blanched white in the dark against the knife, every muscle in my body tensed like coiled wire. When the hand brushed against my throat in the dark, I don't think the grasping thing on the wall knew what I was. It was probing, suspicious but not decisive. I didn't give it time to figure out, though. I would like to say I put a bold plan of action into motion, reacting just as planned when the cold, unseen fingers grazed my skin. I reacted in a blur of spastic flailing, though. Still, it likely saved my life. The ropey, spinely thing above my head had come quite close, and I got lucky with a jab I made in the dark. My knife found purchase, leaving my hand wet with warm, irony blood. I wasted no time in drawing back, hitting the grasping thing again and again and again, within the span of a few seconds. As if just finding its voice, the thing screeched. I can't describe the raw power of the noise, far louder than any gunshot I've heard. The cry ruptured my right eardrum and left my head spinning with near concussive force. There was a clattering of limbs as it fell, rolling from on top of me to the ground beside the pallets, rasping and thrashing. I was stricken several times, fracturing a couple of ribs in the process, but in the rush of the moment, I didn't feel the clumsy, desperate strikes as any more than dull thumps. I scrambled to my feet, backed away along the wall and panicked. Fortunately for me, my addled brain made the right call in the moment. I resolved to flee, with the light on, knowing there were others in the tunnels who would know my position. What was not fortunate, though, was that my light first fell upon the thing that grasped me in the dark, giving me a clear glimpse of what that forgotten rider with his stenopad had termed the Long Man. This was an apt name. It was too stretched, too elongated, too see-through. Its organs and veins were visible in the beam, black against the milky pallor of the semi-transparent skin. Far taller than a human being, it was wiry but light, likely weighing no more than I did. Its hands, oversized and sporting flexible tapering fingers, clutched at a cluster of open wounds along its neck and chest, which pulsed blackish blood at each pump of its dying heart. Its eyes, two impossibly large orbs above a wicked toothed mouth and a skeletal flattened nose, found mine. They were a shocking amber and almost comically wide, frightened. I can't forget the sight of the thing, much as I've tried. Though it was only a startled second that I looked upon its dying form, I know I'll remember every shady detail until my final days. Still, it served to shock me into motion. I wheeled about and ran for the exit, aware of the scattered screeches and clicks in the tunnels as other long men closed on my position. I kept expecting them to pour from the holes in the dividing wall, or to drop down from the ceiling above like leaping spiders. They never interfered though, at least not directly. I can't know whether it was because of the thing's dying cry, or some other reason. I assume they were wary, averse to taking a risk. Though they certainly could have killed me, my lucky break with the first hunter must have made them anxious. Rather than grasping hands or screeching charges, I caught only flashes of pale motion at the edge of the light, and the whistle of thrown rocks clattering off the walls. A few of these hit me, grazing my head and bruising my legs, but I was fortunate. My passage through the second station and the further halls were a blur of harried motion, and I made the first station with little but scrapes and bruises from the bombardment. Then the assault seemed to die away. The scuttling advance of the long men, falling to a whisper, as I neared the exit and the soft glow of late afternoon came into view through the grate. I clattered against the harsh steel of the doors and scrambled with the key, stupidly trying to handle it without letting my flashlight slip from my grip. I was frayed beyond measure, then, desperate and shaking, and it took many excruciating seconds to get the door open. I slipped through, the gates squealing shut behind me, the key ready to bar the way in my wake. In the last rays of light between the closing doors, I saw the wide eyes of several inhuman hunters looking after me, their silhouettes white against the gray of the tunnels. I told my supervisors there were dangerous squatters in the tunnels, never letting the truth of the situation slip. When the police came to question me in the following days, I told them much the same, recasting the encounter as one of urban violence rather than a monstrous encounter. Though I'm sure they sent men into the tunnels, no one has ever followed up with me. I've never found it odd that the city began talks about filling in the tunnel system entirely, soon after my inspection. The attempts to rebrand the half-completed subway as a moody club or concert venue died away too, with the city largely ceasing all public reference to its moldering project. While my peers ummed and awed over why the struggling budget was being tapped for so wasteful a purpose, I kept my mouth shut. I think I know why the city, slow to awaken and slower to action, moved so suddenly to seal off the passages. I also think I know why the city moved to distance me from work, silently severing me from the job. I won't protest though, because that suits me just fine. I have no desire to ever be underground again. No one knew where they came from. Slowly but surely they appeared. On the streets, in the corners of the bathroom, within aisles of libraries and grocery stores. Slender figures stood in gray suits, and they were all over the news, seemingly within days. At first reported as hoaxes not unlike the classic Bigfoot stuff we saw on TV, or even the iconic Slender Man phenomenon.
It then quickly morphed into a psychological dilemma, plaguing the minds of many within minutes. While everyone got crazy over Slender Man all those years ago, communities left and right were now making quick exits out of town when the Faceless came around. The press gave them that name. It wasn't just any cult persona of terror. Truly, we thought it was some sort of invasion, an onslaught that couldn't be stopped. Had to have been aliens or some government conspiracy to control the population. Who knew? But what I did know was that I wasn't going outside without a blindfold. Not even to bring the trash can back into the driveway. You could only imagine the pandemonium. Looters, riots, raging demonstrations of all kinds across streets. Corners and gatherings to rally against whatever it was. Some thought it was the next coming of Christ. Others thought it was E.T. phoning home and transporting all of us to the next Earth, consuming every natural resource, as if we were the invaders without even knowing it. I personally thought they were all interesting conspiracy theories, but thoughts quickly dispersed in watching the news and the latest developments and research of what this virus, or whatever you wanted to call it, did to you. It became known that if you ever come across the Faceless, you had only an average of days. Days when you could remember who you were. They had already documented the metamorphosis in detail, tying the pieces together from incubation to inception to completion. Once you placed your gaze upon any one of them, in any situation, the infection began, sealing orifices in your body shut like glue suddenly. The only way I could describe it was as if your body hemorrhaged, bloating and reacting to a histamine that would elevate and close up channels in your system. Much like how the flu would clog up cavities and sinuses and leave you a complete mess in bed. Somehow, though, the kind of inflammation one would experience managed to contain every necessity necessary for basic living. Breathing, beating heart, even sight. At least until the eyes would completely shut and disappear. Disclaimers across the newscast for all. What you're about to see may be graphic and all would watch, constricting a need for the mob mentality, but with that intention. It's not like the media wanted to cause a panic. But what else would you think would happen? People will simply just freak out. Within seconds, the inflammation would completely close eyes shut, sealed tight, cemented down and somehow smoothed out with no semblance of what used to be eyelids. Just an empty space in the face, followed by the hollowing out of all the crevices where the nose, mouth, and even ears were. To imagine what that felt like, the idea that I couldn't even put it into words, was horror enough for anyone. No one could pinpoint the incubation period. It varied from person to person. Some saw a timeline of weeks, whereas others were more like minutes. Researchers extensively conducted prognoses, sampling blood for any signs of viral infection, but to no avail. The mystery only contributed to the conspiracy theories floating around as flying saucers do, vaporizing White Houses and Pentagons like it was nothing. And then people would really start to panic, thinking this was a true War of the Worlds. These aliens, or whatever they were trying to erase us, not eradicate us, or experiment on us, or enslave us. They just wanted us gone. At least that's what I thought. I couldn't help but wonder, though. Were the Faceless the alien invaders, or something else? Not much else was done as far as research up to a certain point, according to what the news would tell us. I personally thought it was to avoid panic, leaving out certain salient details. It seemed that the infection would apparently reach a peak of volatility and severity that patients would no longer be allowed in the public eye. And all of us who were not infected would never hear another word of it. It was almost like they would all disappear. An exponential eradication, Starting from utility workers and contractors, those working out in the public. They were the first to go. Stadiums, schools, restaurants, anything that thrived at the height of gatherings of large groups. Those were on the front line in a raging outbreak of terrifying magnitude. And then others from more contained environments and malls and industrial buildings were next. What about those more solitary? Writers, artists, even dancers. They were generally next, but much more sporadic. And it didn't make much sense except for the fact that those, including myself, had less opportunity to run into the faceless and face the contamination. The scary thing was, the opportunity came at random times. Like I had mentioned, you never knew when you'd run into one of them. They never spoke. They never chased you. In their oddly clean gray suits, like harmless mannequins, they'd simply stare at you with their nothing eyes, empty gazes locking tractor beams into your soul. Then slowly raising a finger to point directly at you. That's when it would happen. The transformation would begin. You knew your life would be over. It didn't even matter how far away you were if you saw one, and somehow one saw you. You knew you were seen if it raised a finger to you. You were free to believe that it was time for you to disappear. Some would commit suicide only minutes after they ran into one of them. If there ever was a mass suicide weapon, the faceless truly were it. As long as I lasted, it certainly wasn't easy. Although my career thrived through telecommute. Remotely, I wrote captions for TV shows, an odd and disconnected connection to communities, the media, and society. I watched all the Rachel Ray's home improvement shows and more trendy stuff long before they would air, because I was in charge of the captions and where they were placed. Boring? Sometimes. It was a job, but in this day and age, it was a godsend given the coming apocalypse. This was mass genocide at its best, and totally completely non-violent in nature. What did I do for groceries, toiletries, and household items? Simple. Amazon. You'd be surprised at how much paper towels you could order and have flown in by drone at your doorstep. Convenience was key. I only had to keep my eyes closed, open the door and drag the boxes in, then close and bolt the locks. Wi-Fi connection saved me from madness many times. Maintaining that connection to the world of the living, even as I saw hysteria of a race of human monsters flooding to stores in a fury for the latest roll of toilet paper or dish soap, thinking the world was going to end. People with signs wandering down sidewalks and empty ghost towns was about as forlorn as you could imagine. But somehow the worst of it was that it made the media seem that much more sensational and divisive. You began to question what you were watching. Those were the days when you often took what anchormen said with a grain of salt. And now this. I often flooded my metaphorical sandwiches with sodium chloride after listening to these bastards talk about the riots that were going on in our nation. Madness crept in, though. Being stuck inside when I was so used to being stuck inside, purely by habit, was like quicksand being swallowed by quicksand. Compounded by that feeling that I couldn't choose to maybe go for a walk, perhaps. Freedom was a commodity. Yep, I really did like the sedentary and secluded lifestyle, but there was something liberating about the ability to just go to the grocery store and ogle at the ladies if I wanted. I didn't have that anymore. It affected my sleep. In fact, I woke up one day, going to the bathroom, and felt something watching me. Wait, not watching, it was more like voyeuring. That's not even a word, but now it is. Eerie, disturbing, and rather perverted it felt. I turned on the light in the bathroom and freaked out to see one of the faceless staring at me through the mirror. Not me. One of them. I turned the light off. Bile rising in my throat as cold sweat instantly drained me from shock. The inexplicability of seeing a blank face, the gray suit in the mirror. and I instantly knew I was going crazy. Hallucinations, fabrications, strange visions. I wiped my brow, slowly turning the light back on. And there I was, my raggedy face, 5 o'clock shadow, matted hair, pockmarks, and inflated pores. I had a face. Thank God. Knowing that I was seeing things while thankful of the reality, spurred on this age of mental rebellion as I ate bowls and bowls of Lucky Charms while binging Tom and Jerry or Jerry Springer for hours upon hours, to remind me that the psychotic insomnia I suffered was more than just being in that in-between space of sleep and waking. Masturbation only helps so much. I tried playing card games with myself too. Solitaire, anyone? Sure, let's play. I began to imagine that I was, in fact, 2 people, split in halves. And one was an evil little gremlin. The other was something else. Nevertheless, I refused to break the cycle and go out, like some ended up doing, only to be engulfed by the faceless. Sometimes it was hard refusing to watch the news, but you sort of had to, just to maintain any semblance of humanity, connection, communication. There were times I thought the news was actually having a real conversation with me too, and I of course spoke back. This just in, more outbreaks of the faceless reported in the cities of Chicago, Los Angeles. And by golly, Jack, did you put on deodorant today? I shoved another spoonful of Lucky Charms into my mouth. Yeah? Duh. Well, you certainly don't smell like it, as the faceless continue to be spotted in rural areas of the Midwest. I thought it was fun, though, as that anchorwoman was hot anyway. I couldn't remember the last time a hot chick even said one word to me. As the days went by, though, even with the residual income always streaming in and the lack of festivities not ever coming up dry for me, the monotony still swallowed me up like quicksand. And before long, I was breaking my mirrors. I didn't want to look into them anymore, especially when they were cracked. The images were fractured and even freakier than usual. My home wasn't a home. It was a prison. I started to wonder if this is what the faceless wanted out of all of us, to imprison ourselves, and perhaps this whole thing was a ruse. Maybe they tapped into satellites, manipulating the airwaves and making it seem like we absolutely had no choice but to lock ourselves away. Was that the case? I said nay. After all, every once in a while I did see vehicles drive by. Some were military, others were commercial. Some were sedans. It had to be okay. What was I so afraid of? Sure, I'd have no face, and I'd be forced to wear lamb's wool for the rest of my damn life and point fingers at anyone I could find. But I knew I at least would always know who I was, even if no one else would or would care to know. My last bastion. My one solace of being, damn it. I deserved to have at least one thing that could never be taken away. For sure, I had to at least be better than being locked up in my own home. I at the very least would get exercise, if the faceless did benefit from it. Did they? Was there any research on that on the news? It was time to take a chance. Gambles didn't always work. Except this wasn't what I expected. Walking down side streets and sidewalks to notice that there were more people out and about than I thought at first was reassuring until they all started running away from me screaming bloody murder. I had pointed at them, calling out for them to not be scared, but they never listened. They just kept running. As I meandered the empty streets, riddled with broken leaves of autumn under smoky skies, I realized that while I didn't see a single figure of the faceless, I was still all alone, and no better for it. The air felt sweet though, serene even. This was an empty, sad paradise. I wondered if this was how Adam felt before his rib had been taken out. And then tanks showed up, obviously to help me out. The military arrived. Thanks for the tanks. Martial law. Enter true pandemonium. Floods of images caressed my brain of past historical landmarks, of hoses spraying on colored people, Hail Hitlers, and other dreadful calamities to make it seem that while we were all one and the same, even we could be considered cannibals in the darkest of times. There were 5 tanks total, no infantry. That was probably smart given the risk of any soldier locking gazes with the faceless and becoming infected. The tank stopped short about 20 feet of where I stood in the middle of the empty street. Nothing happened after that. This was the point where you had to imagine the military spoke on intercom or something with some reassurance that I was going to be okay. Angels on our shoulders, let freedom reign. I say, can you see? I say, can you see? I couldn't explain everyone running away, but maybe they had answers. Yet the tanks did nothing but stare through the barrels of their guns. Hi, I said with a smile. Was I smiling? I wasn't sure. They need to see my smile. My name is... Wait. What's my name? I went blank. I even felt my face go blank. As I looked around at all the empty stores, abandoned cars, carcasses on the sidewalk, and puddles of water, warning sounds rang in my head. At first, I thought they were those alarms you'd hear when a tornado would hit, but why? Maybe it was all in my head. Then my eyes caught something odd. In one of those puddles of water by me. I looked into one of them, seeing the faint reflection of the smoky sky. And as I peered directly over it, I saw me. I saw what was supposed to be me. I was faceless. The day started just like any other. I got up, went to work, and that's when things start to get a little fuzzy. The next thing I remember is waking up in darkness. The kind of darkness that you can feel surrounding you. You can't see your hand just inches from your face. My breathing starts to pick up as I'm starting to panic. I feel around and can tell I'm on a bed. No restraints. I'm free to move around at will. I run my hand down the wall. It feels like cinder blocks and it's cold. I close my eyes and try to calm my breathing as I wait to allow my eyes to adjust to the darkness. In the quiet, I can hear something stir on the other side of the room. Who's there? I get no answer. Just heavy footsteps slowly heading my way. My breathing speeds up again. Who's there? I scream once again, trying to sound threatening. But the panic in my voice is very prominent and stops me from sounding intimidating. The footsteps stop. I open my eyes and blink rapidly, hoping to speed up the process of my eyes adjusting to the darkness. The only thing I can see is the outline of a towering figure standing in the middle of the room. It raises its hands and pulls something. It was a pull string attached to a light fixture. A dull light comes on and is cutting through the darkness, illuminating the figure that was standing before me. I let out an involuntary yelp of fear as the figure was no human. A thick layer of black fur goes from the feet of the beast up to its neck. Its head was just a skull, looked to me to be the skull of a bear. Horns are protruding from the top of the skull, twisting and curling around like a ram's horn until ending in a sharp point. Even with the thick fur, you can make out the muscular definition in its arms and chest. What do you want? Not even trying to hide my panic at this point. Who are you? Malum, the beast said in a deep demonic voice. Okay, Malum, what do you want? Why am I here? Looking around with the light on, I now notice that I'm in my basement. Please let me go, I have a family. You will go nowhere. You will sit and listen to what I have to say, and see what I have to show you. What the hell could you possibly show me in my basement? With those words, Malum starts to walk towards me.
Terrified, I begin to backpedal across the bed until my back is flat against the cold cinder block wall. Please, please leave me alone, I scream. Malum reaches out his massive hand and places it on my forehead. He could have easily palmed my head like a basketball if he wanted. A flash of light fills my vision, and suddenly I find myself in the back of an SUV going down the interstate. I can't control my body. I'm just a passenger taking in the scene around me. I instantly recognize where I am. It's 2009, and my unborn daughter is having severe complications. We are going to the hospital. I put my hand on my wife's belly and feel her kick. Tears fill my eyes and start to run down my cheeks. I begin to cry, knowing this will be the last time I feel her kick. Another flash and I'm at the graveyard. I'm gazing down at a teddy bear headstone. I just had to bury my daughter. I try to keep it together, but on the inside, I don't know how I will continue. The world is collapsing around me. Suddenly I'm back on the bed in my basement as Malum draws his hand back away from my head. Why did you show me that? I ask with tear-filled eyes. Without a word, Malum snaps his fingers, and the bedside table drawer pops open. I slowly make my way to the open drawer while keeping a close eye on Malum, but he doesn't move. I peer inside to see my .357 Magnum revolver. I reach inside and pull it out. My hand fits perfectly around the black handle grip. I can see my reflection in a long, shiny barrel. What am I supposed to do with this? You have lived a life full of pain. What do you have to live for? Malum asks. You want me to kill myself? I'm not going to do that. In the blink of an eye, Malum is back at the bedside, placing his hand back on my head, followed by that familiar flash of light. It was like a speed round of tragedy I experienced, a flash of light taking me from one scene to the other. It started with me walking in my grandparents' living room to see the paramedics trying to revive my grandfather, unsuccessfully. Numerous fights when I was younger over people making fun of my weight. I was not one to just sit back and take bullying. My first car wreck when I totaled a Mustang after rear-ending a truck. My cousin that I considered a brother stealing from me. It all leads up to the one thing in my life that hasn't been able to heal. It has been a year and a half and it still hurts to my core. It was last summer, 10 years after the first flashback. I'm kissing my kids on the forehead. They're crying as they get in the car with their mom. I'll miss you, Dad, my oldest yells out before the door shuts in her face. My wife had cheated after 11 years of being together. When I walk in the house, I regain control of my body. I go to the freezer and pull out a bottle. I go flop back in my recliner and turn up the bottle of cheap Canadian whiskey. It hurts so much, but I have to put on a brave face and be strong for the kids. Now that the kids are spending the week with their mom, I will drink my pain away. How could this bitch do this to me? I say aloud to no one, but to my surprise, I get a response. The deep demonic voice of Malum rings out from behind me. You didn't pay her enough attention, so she found someone that would. I worked 60 hours a week to provide for us. I did the best I could. And a relationship is a two-way street. We both have to put in an effort. I had all the same reasons to cheat as she did, but my dumb ass stayed faithful. Sometimes during my tirade, my surroundings slowly melted from my living room back to my cold, musty basement. I'm now standing in front of the only mirror in the basement hanging on the wall. My hands are shaking as I stare at the .357 Magnum. All I've done is try my hardest to be the best I can, and it's never good enough. Maybe Malum is right. Unexpectedly, my reflection moves out of sync with me. All I can do is watch my reflection raise his hand and put the gun to his head. What do you have to live for? My reflection says before pulling the trigger and blowing a giant hole in his head, dropping to the ground with a thud. I turned to see Malum standing in the center of the basement. You try so hard to get nowhere. Why do you keep going? You didn't show any of the good. All you showed was the tragedy in my life. I have a great job. I have loving friends and a great family that is there for me when I need them. I went on to have 3 more wonderful children. They love me with all their heart, and I would do anything for them. That is my reason for living. I will not leave them behind. By now, the terror has left, and my blood is boiling. I'm screaming at this monster standing in the middle of my basement. I will never kill myself. I have plenty to live for. Malum lets out a roar that sounds like a mix of a bear and a demon. I aim the .357 at him and unload. 2 bullets strike his stomach, and he lets out another roar. I continue to shoot. 3 more to his chest, and the last one connects with Malum's head, blowing a chunk of the bear-like skull off, and it drops to the floor with a clink. Malum falls to the ground. I don't give him a chance to get up before I run up the stairs and out the basement door. As I exit the basement, a bright light fills my vision. The light hurts my eyes but soon dissipates, and I find myself in a hospital room looking down at myself, lying in a hospital bed hooked up to numerous machines. The door opens and my dad rushes in. My mom is sitting on the chair beside the hospital bed. I have no idea how I didn't see her sitting there earlier. He's in a coma. The doctors aren't sure if he will pull through, my mom tells my dad. They embrace and cry in each other's arms. A movement in the corner of the room catches my eye. It's Malum. I don't know what else I expected since I'm still trapped in whatever hell this is. Why won't you die? I scream at him as I close the gap between us. You've tortured me with the tragedies of my past, and now what is this, my future? It's your present, Malum explained. He must have seen the confusion on my face. I'll show you. Before I can protest, he reaches out and places his hand upon my head once again, followed by the flash of light. Suddenly I'm speeding down a back road, whiskey bent and hellbound, blaring from the speakers. I'm drunk, depressed, and careless with my own life and any other lives that may be on the road that night, bending the curves with reckless abandon. Tires were screeching around each curve as I pushed my car to its limits. I reach over and grab the bottle of whiskey lying in my passenger seat. I pop off the top, and I turn it up and take a few large gulps. By the time I'm done and my eyes meet the road once more, I'm speeding much too fast into a sharp curve. I smash the brake pedal with everything I have. The brakes lock down and the car skids into the curve and off of an embankment. The front of my car are meeting a tree. The airbag is the only thing that kept me from exiting the car through the front windshield. Flash, and I'm back in the hospital room. My mom's still by my side. Malum is still standing in the corner. Are you keeping me from coming out of the coma? Malum was silent. The gun did nothing to help me escape this hell. So I did the only other thing I could think of, to destroy this evil trapping me in my mind. I haven't been to church in a decade, but I hadn't forgotten how to pray. I start my prayer to whisper, and I notice that Malum was beginning to act restless. So I get louder and walk towards him. That's not a good idea, Malum says with malice in his voice. I begin to speed walk towards him, and before long I'm only inches from the beast. At this point, I'm screaming this prayer at the top of my lungs. Malum bends down to get face to face with me before letting out a roar so loud that it left my ears ringing. I didn't let it stop me. I continued the prayer, and this time I put my hand on his forehead. Malum's empty eye sockets begin to glow with a bright white light. He lets out another roar, this time with a hint of pain behind it. I press my hand harder on his head and continue my prayer. Malum drops to his knees, and I finish my prayer with an amen. The white light beaming from his eyes overtakes the entire hospital room. as the light began to dissipate and my blurry vision began to clear. The light that had previously filled the room was now just a fluorescent light bulb attached to the ceiling above me. I look around to see the hospital room I had saw myself dying in. I see my mom asleep on the hospital recliner beside the bed. Despite all the pain I was in, I couldn't keep myself from smiling. I recovered fully from my injuries. I quit smoking, cut my drinking down to socially, and will never drive drunk again. I started eating better and going to the gym as often as I can. I'm determined to turn this pathetic life around. Not just for me, but my kids. Never give in to the evil inside. I guess to begin with, I had a career of narrating creepypastas on YouTube. Originally, it started out as a hobby, but I eventually got to a point where I could do it full-time and make a decent living out of it. I'd been interested in creepypastas for a few years and listened to a lot of narrators. My favorite was always Demon Creep. Whenever he read stories or did Let's Plays on his channel, I had written my own stories and sent them to him. It gave me the idea of, I want to do this. So I practiced my storytelling abilities, and with some tech classes, I began my own YouTube channel. I would narrate other people's stories I found on Reddit, and on occasion, narrated my own stories. I would even post non-creepypasta related material like music and videos. I did some experimentation with ASMR, but found that to be unlike me. My narration voice had a Let's Read or King Spook kind of quality. A deep, velvety tone with a hint of something sinister behind it, like a madman's lullaby. Sorry, I guess I got some of Liam Vickers' sense of poetics as well. Now, if you're wondering about my channel and want to check it out, don't bother. I deleted it, as well as all of my social media and fundraising accounts, and changed my email. I made sure no trace of my work existed anywhere on the internet anymore. After what I had just gone through, I felt like it was best to delete everything. To me, one story can make or break my career. You can probably guess which one I happened upon. One story I received, one that practically got me arrested, turned out to not be a story at all. It was a murder confession. Now, sometimes I would go to creepypasta.com and select stories there, but I also had a subreddit in which people could submit their stories to me. This story came through there. It was submitted by a user I didn't recognize. I can't give any details about it because, as far as I know, everything is still under investigation. The story went as follows. I was driving down a dark road in an almost blinding rain. The back road was slick and wet, that I nearly drove myself into a ditch. It would have been very easy to drive off the road and get into an accident if I didn't have my headlights and high beams on. I was listening to the local radio broadcast, being informed of some missing people from the Tri-City area. All were young women with seemingly no connection to each other. After a while, the rain had finally stopped, and I could see everything a little more clearly. The clouds overhead had parted, and the moon had revealed her rays on this back road. Up ahead, I could make out the shape and lights of a parked car on the side of the road, the blinker signaling hopefully any other traveler out tonight. As I got closer, I could make out the shape of a person leaning against a vehicle, wearing a bright yellow coat. I got closer and found that it was a young woman, standing outside of her car. She was pretty enough to be sure. She was naturally tan-skinned with matching hazel brown hair. Her bright raincoat was the only other source of brightness around here. The most striking feature about this woman that I had noticed before anything else was her eyes. They were the shade of green like a pair of emeralds. They were a seemingly otherworldly shade of green. "You okay?" I asked the girl. My car started acting up and died. My phone isn't working either. Can I get a lift?" she asked with her face full of gloom.
I told her I'll be happy to help her out. Those kind words brought a smile to her sad face instantly. "Oh, thank you so much," she squealed as she practically jumped into the passenger seat. I drove off, leaving her lonely car behind in the darkness. She turned out to be going in the same direction I was going, so giving her a lift wasn't too big of a deal. We rode in relative silence for a while, aside from the radio station still reporting on the missing people. She was quiet amid the reporting, maybe knowing someone who went missing or feeling uncomfortable with the subject matter. I found myself making quick glances at her. Besides the wetness of her clothing and her hair, she was pretty. "So, where are you heading?" I asked curiously. "I'm just heading home," she responded, not taking her eyes off the road. "I spent more time with my friends tonight than I should have, so I had to go back. I got hit with the rain and my car started acting up on me." "You mean just friends or boyfriend?" I asked bashfully. She turned and gave a friendly smile at me. "Just friends," she informed me. I smiled back at her. "Where are you heading from?" she asked me. "I'm just coming back from a shift," I told her. "I'm a carpet cleaner." She nodded back to me. It was a few minutes before we said anything else. "Thanks again for helping me. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't shown up." I glanced at her, again hypnotized by her eyes. "You know, you should be really careful when hitchhiking or flagging down a ride. You don't know what kind of psychos are out there. The person behind the kidnappings could have gotten you instead of someone else." Her smile faded and she nodded. "Interesting fact. Did you know Edmund Kemper, the co-ed killer, picked up hitchhikers and killed them in a remote spot?" "Oh, really?" A look of nervousness had begun to carve on her face. "I'm sorry," I said with a slight chuckle. I have an interest in abnormal psychology and serial killers, and I tend to blurt out facts at random. "No, it's okay, it's kind of fascinating," she said with a slight laugh. I could tell she was trying to hide her discomfort by wearing a fragile mask of politeness. Given her predicament, she had no choice but to take a ride with some random person. We didn't say anything else for a while as I drove onward. I later assured her I knew of a shortcut as I turned on another street in the backwoods area. I knew this spot very well. It was a quiet area, especially this time of night. I slowed the car to a stop, telling my passenger I made a wrong turn. I made her believe I was reaching for my phone to pull out a map. Instead, I pulled out my switchblade and shoved the knife into her exposed neck. She never had the time to respond. After pulling the knife out of her flesh, the blood flowed out of her neck like red ribbons on her skin. She began suffocating while looking at me with terror. She had exited the vehicle while losing more and more blood. I laughed, knowing full well that she'd be dead well before any help came along. All she had to go on was just the slightest bit of hope for survival. This was a sight I took delight in, just seeing how far they'd go before they collapse from blood loss and the body gives out. She had gone about 5 feet away from the road, and into the clearing before her knees buckled and she collapsed under her own weight. She had writhed on the ground after making contact with the cold, damp earth. I admit she had gone farther than I expected her to. The last one never made it even 2 feet away from me before the same thing happened. I lit up a Marlboro and waited for her to finish dying. She gave some small twitches as I observed her at a distance. When I stopped hearing noises coming from her, I walked over to her still, dead form. A quick nudge from my boot informed me that she was, in fact, lifeless, aside from her eyes remaining open. I made the quick work of plucking at her green eyes and placed them in a jar I keep in the trunk. I drove off, leaving my victim behind in the darkness. Someone might find her later. I don't want to be here when they do. This story made for a short video, but it became a success overnight.
I had countless views and comments, all saying how real the story felt, and others making crude jokes about the murder. I admit I even thought it was real for a second. It was as if I was observing the events through the killer's eyes. I didn't realize how real it turned out to be. It was a day or two later, late morning, when I heard a knock at my door. I opened it to be greeted by 2 police officers and a squad car in my driveway. They got my identification and I was escorted by them to the car. They didn't mention that I was under arrest, but rather that they had questions for me. I felt obligated to go along and cooperate. I waited in an interrogation room, complete with a simple desk, 1 chair, and what I assumed to be a 2-way mirror. Someone might have been on the other side, deciding what to do with me. All that went through my mind was what happened that got me in here. After a long time, 2 people entered. The man was a burly white male in a white-collared shirt and rolled-up sleeves. I don't know what health issues he had, but sweat seemed to have glistened his exposed arms and face. The other person was an African-American woman in a purple coat and skirt. I was thinking one of them may have been a detective and the other one was an actual cop. They'd come inside and their stoic faces had stared right into me. "We understand you have a YouTube channel, right?" the woman asked. I had answered in the affirmative. They inquired about my latest video, about a murder. I told them about it and asked what was going on and why I was there. They answered me, and the explanation still gives me a feeling of nausea and freezes my blood. About 7:30 a.m. in the previous morning, 2 civilians were driving down Old County Road, an unpaved dirt road just outside of town. They stopped on the road due to a flat tire. While making changes to a new one, the passenger noticed a strange white shape in the clearing off the road in the grass. They'd gotten close enough to see the shape better and screamed loud enough to break the morning silence. The sight was a body of a young girl, mutilated and dead. She laid still, pale and damp from a mix of morning dew and dried blood. There was an obvious knife wound in her neck, aimed right at the jugular veins so she would bleed out the quickest. That wasn't the only detail about this gruesome discovery. There were also 2 bloodied holes where her eyes should have been. 2 red, dark caverns in a frozen face that had become home to insects. An ambulance and the police made it to the scene and began the investigation. The victim in question still had her ID and wallet with her. The killer obviously didn't want anything of monetary value from her, but I know what they did want. The one detail on her card that stuck with me was her eye color: green. The police had other leads in the Tri-City area. There were other reports of women either going missing or being found as bloodied corpses, all with missing eyes. This killing spree had been going on for about a year now. The only 2 things that linked these victims together was that they were all given a ride by someone else due to car problems, and their eyes were some shade of green. This person, who they called the Green-Eyed Killer, was still at large as far as they knew. The details of the scene weren't yet known to the public at the time my video came out. The police were digging for details and clues, and somehow one of them caught my video and linked me to the murder. I told them the details about how I got the story submitted to me a couple nights ago on Reddit. They were skeptical about my explanation, but decided to keep me in a cell until they decided what to do with me. They did a search of my house and checked my laptop. After a few hours of finding the story like I told them, and finding nothing else to link me to the crime, they let me go. But they kept my computer for a while. I didn't follow the details of the investigation after being let go. I eventually got my laptop back, and when I did, the first thing I did was tell my fan base about what had happened, and that I made the toughest choice of my life. I thanked everyone for all the love and support, and I deleted everything. My Reddit page, my channel, my social media accounts, and my fundraising accounts were all deleted. I got rid of everything because I didn't want to go through another incident like that. Worst, I hated the idea of profiting off a murder just for views. I'll end it with a warning. If you're a young woman with green eyes and your car breaks down during the night, Be careful who you get a ride from. They may be the last face you ever see. Something smelled. It was coming from the attic above my brother Henry's bedroom. The old farmhouse reeked of death. It wasn't the same sweet-smelling place it once was. Ever since that Sunday in August, when the new minister, Pastor Rick, came to our town, something had changed. He put a spell on the entire city when he arrived. He laid hands on little Jolie Pike, who was dying of cancer. She healed right up a few days later. Pastor Rick led sermons of fire and brimstone and told us we'd all go to hell unless we asked Jesus Christ to forgive us of our sins. Pastor Rick was strict and didn't like teenagers very much. He called us unclean messengers of Satan, and the things we did alone in our bedrooms, God could see, especially us boys. Pastor Rick never left the town either. I started to notice that no new people came either, slowly. It was as though once he arrived, we lived in our own sort of utopia. Peaceful townsfolk who worshipped on Sundays and took a fellowship with one another whenever they could. Pastor Rick was like the second coming of Christ. He was purposefully kind to all of the children in our town as well. Pastor Rick was particularly fascinated with my younger siblings. He often offered them a ride into town or to church. I didn't interest him much. I was 19 and stuck around to help my parents with the farm. I was the oldest boy of the three of us. There was me, Johnny, then Henry, and our baby sister Elsa. She was 15 that August. Pastor Rick often called upon Elsa to read scripture during teen Bible study, which she secretly hated. He used Henry to help out with his lawn and paid him handsomely. Pastor Rick could do no wrong in anyone's eyes. That soon changed. Elsa was happy and had just had her first kiss. I knew because I was the one who caught her. I laughed and she was downright mortified. I promised I wouldn't tell Ma and Pa. I wasn't like Henry. He'd sure as shit run his mouth every chance he got. It wasn't long after Elsa's new beau, Ken, caught smoking behind the church. It was Pastor Rick that found him. After that incident, Ken was sent to a camp that Pastor Rick founded for teenagers that got into trouble. He said that Ken was on his way to a place that only led straight to hell, unless he got right with God. No one saw Ken again. Elsa was angry and blamed Pastor Rick. She rebelled and stopped attending Sunday services. When my parents found out, they tried forcing her to go, but she would not. That is when they asked Pastor Rick to come to our house to talk some sense into her. My parents were devout Christians and looked up to Pastor Rick because of all the miracles. Jolie Pike wasn't the only child he had helped. There was Billy Thompson, who lived with his abusive father. He made sure that Billy never got hit on again. He let Billy move in with him, and Billy was always at Pastor Rick's side. He seemed happier after Pastor Rick took him in. Pastor Rick came by on that late September afternoon, and when he did, he insisted on speaking to Elsa alone in her room. 25 minutes passed, and then we heard her scream. My father, the ever-protective parent, broke into her room to find Pastor Rick pinning her down with a cross. "What the hell is going on?" my father barked. "This child is possessed by a demon." Pastor Rick held her into place, and when I saw her eyes, there was no denying that a demon indeed possessed her. She writhed, screamed, and she growled. The room went black and the lights in the hallway flickered. Elsa spat and she bit at Pastor Rick. Her previously stated hatred for him only increased in the state she was in. My family had no choice but to trust this man of God. We all stood in shock and terror. This was the type of thing you only saw in movies. Elsa managed to calm him down a bit, and Pastor Rick insisted on her transport to another area of our home that had fewer items in it that could harm her or us when she was having her fits of anger. My father suggested the attic, and so my parents put out a mattress and tied her arms and legs to chains on the floor as Pastor Rick instructed them. He stayed out of the room while he waited for Elsa to be tied down. All the while she fought and she screamed, and yellow pus fell from scabs on her face. We lived in terror for days, and only in quiet times when my sister was calm did I try and help her eat and drink. Pastor Rick made daily visits to our home to try and expel the demon from her. I made sure I visited her every day to make sure she kept up her strength. Elsa would calm down and turn back to normal in those few moments when Pastor Rick wasn't around. As soon as he came back to our house to treat Elsa, she would once again turn into a rabid animal. Elsa would remain afraid of us and vice versa. "There's nothing wrong with me, Johnny. You're scaring me," she said as I fed her soup and bread. "Elsa, I saw you with my own eyes. You turned into a rabid beast, and that scared me." I heard the door to the attic slowly creep open, and I stood up as Pastor Rick walked in, spewing his venom of Bible scripture. Billy was with him and helped pin Elsa into place so that she could get the full amount of the Lord's word. Elsa wouldn't eat anymore. Instead, she screamed at the top of her lungs and kicked and tried scratching my face. She scratched at me as though she were afraid of me, and I backed away in fear because her eyes had gone black. I ran from the room because, according to Pastor Rick, he had to be alone with the demon so that when it left, it didn't try and enter another person's body. Pastor Rick came out of the attic that night, insisting that no one go in until the morning. We complied with his wishes and waited till morning. When morning came, we waited, and still there was no response from Pastor Rick. My father knocked on the door a few times, but Billy was there, stopping my father from entering. "It is a sensitive time," Billy said. "Please, a while longer." My mother and father didn't eat. They didn't sleep. No one in our house ate or slept. There were screams all hours of the night as though someone was being ripped in half. If I had not witnessed Elsa with my own eyes, I would never have believed she was possessed. Finally, after 3 long days, Pastor Rick came out of my sister's room, solemn with a look of defeat. "I'm afraid your daughter suffers greatly, and I do not think there is anything else we can do. The demon has taken hold of her. Let me take her to a place where we can help her. I have a farm just outside of town where my wayward children live. There are people there that can take care of her in a way you can't." My father thought long and hard about it, and then shook his head. "I'm sorry, Pastor. My child will stay with us. She will not be sent away. I believe with God's help we can and will defeat this demon." Pastor Rick's eyes grew heavy and dark. "Are you sure you know what you were doing?" "Yes," my father answered confidently. "Well then, come on, Billy. There is nothing else we can do to help them. Please keep in mind the devil dwells within your house now. When you turn your back on God, you open the door to the devil. I tried to help." My father let Pastor Rick leave, and then he slowly opened the door to the attic. The foul smell took my father's breath away because there were feces, urine, and old uneaten food all around her, as flies buzzed all around. My father choked back tears when he saw my sister. She was thin, fragile, and still chained to the floor. There was something about her face that puzzled me. It was no longer demonic looking, and the scabs on her face had disappeared. The only thing wrong with her was the fact that she was so scared and traumatized from the treatment of her exorcism. I helped my father and mother get Elsa up, and my mother bathed her. Elsa had bruises all over her body, and she refused to speak to anyone. She remained fearful, and I assumed it was because of what had happened to her. Later that night, my mother went into her bedroom to check on her after she had fallen asleep, when I heard my mother scream, and then I heard Elsa screaming. My mother ran down the hallway and into my room. "Johnny, help me with your sister." When I walked into the bathroom, Elsa was curled up into a ball on the bathroom floor wrapped in a large towel. She wouldn't look at either of us. Instead, she remained hidden behind her long, dark hair. I heard a knock at the door, and when my father went to the front door, that is when I saw him. Pastor Rick, now is not a good time, my father said. I think it is the best time. I had a premonition about your daughter. I believe that she is still in need of relief. Your family cannot possibly cope with the pain of losing her to Satan. I think you need to go. I'll see you in church Sunday, Pastor Rick, as we always do. You are no man of God, and therefore are no longer welcome in my church. My father was puzzled, but his main concern was Elsa. Once Pastor Rick left, my sister returned to her regular self. No wild eyes or demonic screaming. A strange thing happened that Sunday when most of the townsfolk went to the church. They found the windows boarded up and the doors locked. Pastor Rick was nowhere to be found. Elsa no longer had any further episodes, and strangely, the town went back to being normal again. One thing happened that left me scarred for a long time after he left. One afternoon, Elsa and I were taking a walk in our fields, after taking our 2 horses for a ride, when she said something I will never forget. I know Pastor Rick tried to help me. Yes, I think he did. I'm mostly glad he's gone, she began. Because when he was around, all of you became so different. It is like he had a spell on you. How were we different? I asked her, confused. Well, when he was around, you all turned into demons. He kept me away from you all for days and wouldn't let me get help. He said that when you were in the throes of your possessions, you were evil. That is why I was chained and locked away. Dad and Mom chained me up. I will never look at them and not see those yellow eyes and those evil laughs. I looked at her in horror. So you were saying you saw us as the possessed ones? Yeah. It scared me when you said you saw me. I laid in the attic for days while Pastor Rick talked to me, trying to comfort me. Pastor Rick said if I wanted to go away with him and away from all of you, that all I had to do was say it. I didn't want to go with him. There was something about him, a darkness I cannot explain. I agreed, but said no more to Elsa about it. For a long time, we forgot about Pastor Rick. A new pastor opened the church back up. The new pastor was nothing like Pastor Rick. He seldom bothered with the townsfolk when he wasn't preaching. He was a quiet sort of man who kept to himself. Years passed, and then one day I was driving home from a business trip in another state. On my drive home, I was passing what looked like a small village. There was smoke all around it, and the stench coming from it smelled familiar to me. It smelled exactly like our home when Elsa had suffered from her possessions. The stench of death and decay. I passed a massive farm as I drove towards my exit to the little village, which was a shortcut to my town. As I passed, I saw a crowd of children. I looked at them, and they all looked back at me with yellow eyes like that of a devil. I nearly wrecked my car when I saw them. Instead, and for whatever reason, I stopped my car as I could go no further into this town. It was as if something was telling me I was not welcome here. Behind them was a cloud of smoke and ash. The town looked as though it had become entirely charred. Through a cloud of smoke, I saw him wearing his black suit and top hat. He beckoned for the children to come to him. The tall man smiled as I looked at him through the smoke, as he stood on the other side of the fence. I felt safer knowing there was a barrier between us, because the man was none other than Pastor Rick, and I suddenly felt him reading my mind. Don't worry, Johnny. Once I'm finished here, I'll come back. For you. I saw a vision then of the world burning all around me. Demons and acts of evil all around me. There was a piece of fence that fell, and the 2 pieces of wood broke away to form an upside-down cross. I got into my car and drove away as fast as I could. Now I wait for him to come back and finish what he started in our little town. He will go to the other towns first. He will show you miracles and provide many gifts. The next town may be yours.